بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله وكفى وسلام على عباده الذين اصطفى أما بعد رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقهوا قولي سبحانك لا علم لنا إلا ما علمتنا إنك أنت العليم الحكيم. I was just saying, when the room's lit up, then you don't feel sleepy and you feel like learning as well. So if you can keep that momentum going. But anyway, Assalamu alaikum, dear respected scholars and attendees as well. It's delightful to see so many people here from last week as well, and we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that He inspires us with true knowledge, and in our case, true historical knowledge of our Muslim heritage as well. So hopefully we're going to take it all the way up till the wire here today with Isha, because we've got quite a lot to cover. So I'm going to try and break it into 4 chunks. So next 20 minutes, well 5 minutes maybe quick recap, because I think we did have a bit last week. I know Mona Kilsa was saying that we advertised as a crash course, and then we crashed halfway through as well, because we did have quite a bit of information as well. But if we can just recap that at the start, then we'll solidify that. Then we're going to talk about the Ghaznavids, still not up to the Mughals yet, the Delhi Sultanate, and then we can finally begin with what this course was advertised for as the Mughals. So if you want to go to the next one, please. So what I've done is I've just remodeled the session. So last week it was meant to be the crash course. We started it. This week we're going to finish off the crash course, and we're just going to talk about the inception. So the first, you could say, Mughal Sultan, and how the Mughal state actually came around. And if you notice, what I've done is I've actually taken out Aurangzeb as a standalone session, just because we want to fit this into 4 sessions. But the third session on the greater Mughals will focus heavily on him, because obviously he is the Muslim Marmite figure today. I mean, you either hate him or you either love him, and that's a worldwide sentiment. So he's the most, I don't think it'd be far-fetched to say at this moment in time he's the most controversial Muslim figure in the world. So we'll talk about him in the greater Mughals, and then in the lesser Mughals, it's more about the decline. So when things started to go downhill. Sorry, if you want to go next, please. Next as well. Right, so we just want to quickly recap. So last week, we had 2 main segments. We had the introduction, and then we talked about the beginnings of Muslim history. So I'm going to be asking questions here, so hopefully I don't put people on the spot. The first distinction that we made, the misnomer, the misnaming of Islamic history, and then it's applied, just paintbrushed for the entire era, from the Prophet's time all the way up until today. So what did we say? We then made a distinction between Islamic history, and then on the other side we had Muslim history. And can anybody remember the neologism, the new word that was given by Marshall Hodgson for Muslim history? Islamicate, mashallah. Yeah, so Islamic history and then Islamicate history. When does Islamic history start? Prophet's era. When does it end? The 4 Khalifas. And then when does Islamicate history start? From the Umayyads, and then all the way up until today, actually. Up until today. Yeah, so that's another misconception we want to debunk, that history has finished. So people tend to think Muslim history is all about the caliphates. So we'll only ever focus on the main heartlands and the main regions of Muslim civilization. We're talking about Central Asia, the Middle East, and then maybe North Africa. But the problem is, we often then overlook those fringe regions like Africa. East Africa, West Africa. They had no contact with the Muslim caliphate, but they were rich regions of Muslim development and advancement, especially in the last 300 years. Even India as well. The caliphate didn't have a reach over India, especially in the Mughal region, in the Mughal reign. But it's still they still play a very important part in our Muslim history. So anyway, that was important. Main reason, if you want to sum up Islamicate and Islamic history, sorry brother. Yep.
Just a quick question, Maulana.
Yep.
If we make our desire to meet Allah, then if we doubt our desire, isn't that shaitan?
Good question, but is it okay if we pause it till the end? Just because we don't want to break the history flow, and we'll get to that to the end, inshallah. That's no problem. And just remind me if I do forget, but it's an important question. Anyway, so Islamic history and Islamicate history. If you want to sum it up, Islamic history is divine, and Muslim/Islamicate history is human. Yeah, so human beings are going to commit all sorts of atrocities and crimes and massacres and genocides and travesties, but that doesn't truly represent the religion, right? Hopefully we've case closed with that one. Then we carried on by saying, history, you normally approach it with two lenses, didactic and educational. Didactic means you want to take a lesson, a moral for it, and educational, you want to learn something about it. So we said here, we're focusing more on education. Now, there are lots of didactic lessons to learn and morals that can be gleaned and obtained from the Mughal history, but the reason why we're focusing on the Mughals is we want to counter the propaganda which is being spewed out and literally churned out of India, really. And we said, you can go online, you can find so many research studies backed by statistics to show that a lot of false information to do with Islam is emanating from India. And it's being mass-produced and publicized on social media websites, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, even Snapchat, believe it or not, Snapchat and TikTok as well. So they've hijacked all mass media platforms as well. So we want to counter that, because if you want to remember, there's one hadith when it comes to talking about Muslim personalities. And the Prophet ﷺ said in Sahih Muslim, if a Muslim is slandered in your presence, it's your duty to defend his honor. So for us, when it comes to history, now remember what we said, Muslim history is human. So that means that if somebody has committed any crimes, or if somebody has contravened Islam or Islamic law, we're not obliged to defend them. It's our duty. We are obliged to investigate the historical events and reference the data properly. Once we have done that, and if it transpires that they have committed crimes, we hold our hands up and we say, yes, they committed crimes, but it doesn't truly reflect our religion. But there are some of these Mughal sultans, for example, Aurangzeb, who've been the target of derise and revilement and disparagement, way beyond proportions. And it's completely been blown out of the air. And when we come to his section, then we'll talk about the type of propaganda and slander that's made against Aurangzeb. Now remember, these propaganda slogans don't come from nowhere. They do have a basis, but the problem is that basis isn't properly understood. And what happens is history is then doctored. Doctored meaning it's changed to suit political agendas. So that's one thing you want to keep in mind when we talk about the Mughals. BJP and the Hindutva nationalists, they've hijacked Mughal history, and the reason why they've taken a keen interest in Mughal history is because they want to deem the Muslim populace today in India as foreigners, and as people who don't belong there, and as aliens. Now, if you can then mass produce that slogan, India, how many people? You've got 1 billion people there. 1 billion people. And you've got maybe, if I can remember correctly, the statistics were 200 million Muslims there at this moment in time. So now, if the vast majority are Hindus, and if they now buy into this indoctrination that the Muslims aren't actually meant to be there, and it's not their land, they don't belong here, then you can well imagine how the Hindus are going to react. And just your lay folk and the mass population. They won't think about it. They'll be fed information, and that'll be their outlook. Muslims don't belong here. So we need to counter that. So that's why we're focusing on the Mughal, just as a bit of a recap. Okay, quickly, just to finish up on this. The first point we mentioned, we talked about all the way back to the Prophet ﷺ's time. And we actually had to dispel a myth. Does anybody know who that myth was about? And his name's a bit of a mouthful, so I wouldn't... so I'd forgive you for not remembering it. There was one Indian king. Okay, does anybody know where he was from in India? Which region? Kerala. He was from Kerala. His name was Charaman Perumal. The thing is, that wasn't actually his name. Charaman was the name given to, the title given to any leader of the Kerala dynasty. And Perumal was actually the name of one of the gods. Perumal means the omniscient. So the one that knows everything. And that was given then to their leader. And we said that some legends have been diffused around. Sorry, but if I can just, I'll get to your question in a moment. So,
I've got another question.
if we can leave it to the end, then inshallah I can. Yeah, if you wanna write it down, and then we'll pass it on along the end. We'll pass it down, and then we'll get onto that, inshallah. So,
One more question.
right, go on quickly. If it's not to do with history, I'm sorry, but I'll have to defer it till the end. Just because this is a history-focused course. I know it might be an important question, but Jazakumullah. Anyway, so Charaman Perumal, we talked about him. He didn't actually go to the Prophet. Some people say he was a companion. He wasn't actually a companion. He didn't actually see the moon splitting. He didn't make his way to India, and he didn't then send a famous companion, a famous tabi'i, a famous successor, to build the first mosque in India in 629. The facts don't add up. And the first mention we have of that story is in 1510 by a Portuguese explorer called Barbosa. So I mean, where was his history for 800 years? So he did exist, but not in that time frame, not in the time span of the Prophet ﷺ's life. So that's to do with the Prophet's time. Then we moved on to Umar radiallahu anhu's time. And we talked about three brothers. Where did they come from? Which tribe did they hail from, the three brothers? Banu Thaqif. And which city did they come from? Banu Thaqif. From Ta'if. So you had three brothers. You had Uthman radiallahu anh, then you had Hakam, and then you had Mughira. So under Uthman's leadership, he sent out two, you could say, incursion missions. One to Gujarat and Bombay on the west coast of India, and then one to modern-day Karachi. So that was the first time Muslims had actually set foot on Indian soil. But they didn't actually set up any state, and it was more of a skirmish or a raid rather than a proper takeover or conquest or invasion. And then it ended there. Then we said that Umar radiallahu anh, Uthman radiallahu anh, Ali radiallahu anh, they all had encounters with the Sindhi government. So Sindh is a modern-day province of Pakistan. So the Sindhi government and the Sindhi rulers and the leaders, they were supporting the Persians in their fight against the four rightly guided caliphs. So the Sindhi government were always on the radar of the Muslims. And that only then erupted into a full-scale war during the time of the Umayyad time, under whose leadership? Household name. I'll start off Muhammad ibn al-Qasim. Muhammad ibn al-Qasim from Thaqif. That was in the year 711. And the reason why the year 711 is such a monumentous year for Muslims is because you had three simultaneous expeditions and conquests which had taken place. One in the west, in the Iberian Peninsula, Spain. And two in the east. One with Muhammad ibn al-Qasim into Sindh, modern-day Pakistan. And the other one by Qutayba ibn Muslim into what we can say is modern-day China. So the Central Asian states, the Stan countries, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan, moving into Tibet as well, Qutayba ibn Muslim. So this is under the Umayyad rule. So Muhammad ibn al-Qasim, we talked about why he was forced into fighting the Sindhi ruler, Raja Dahir, and how he decimated his forces, and then he set up nominal Umayyad rulership and kingship in Sindh. Now the problem was, because it was so far away from the capital in Damascus, and because it was financially untenable to finance an army and finance a government to take care of affairs in Sindh, those regions which Muhammad ibn al-Qasim had once conquered, slowly started to fall out of favor and slowly started to fall into disrepair. So effective governance now ended in Sindh. And that's where we left off. Now we're hopefully going to carry on. So if you can just skip all the way, I'll tell you when to stop. Yep, so these are all the main points that we talked about last week. Okay, and one more. Okay, right, just one back, sorry, please. Right, so 7-11. Sorry, Mohsen. Ji.
So didactic is taking lessons.
Ji.
Educational is just facts.
Facts, yeah, just pure facts and figures, pure educationalist as well. So you can say education is to do with the mind, and didactic more to do with the heart as well. Okay, now we're going to make a big jump here. We're going to make quite a huge jump. So I'm going to fill you in on the gaps. We're going to jump from the year 711 all the way to the year 977. So now the problem is, it's not actually a problem, but it can prove to be a problem for people who are uninitiated in history. Events all link in with one another. It's like a domino effect. So you've not got, in history, nothing is isolated. So it'll always be interconnected with something else, and another region, and another geographical location. So you have to be aware of everything. You have to have at least a brief chronology, a brief timeline of events in your mind to help all the events make sense. So you can piece together this jigsaw puzzle. So we left off in the year 711. So we need to talk about the Prophet ﷺ's time and the ensuing Muslim empires and dynasties. The first one we've got is 632 CE. The Prophet ﷺ passed away. That now inaugurated the era of the rightly guided caliphs, the Rashidite Caliphate. And let's just quickly enumerate them. We had four. Number one was Abu Bakr radiallahu anh. Number two, Umar radiallahu anh. Number three, Uthman. And number four, Ali radiallahu anh. That ended in the year 661. 661 is when Muawiyah radiallahu anh now took the reins of the Muslim empire, And that's when the Umayyad era started. Umayyad meaning people who hailed from the tribe of Banu Umayyah, and they were the most elite tribe of Quraysh. So they took charge. That was from 611 all the way till 750. So for nearly 90 years. And then in the middle there you can see 711, Muhammad ibn al-Qasim's expedition into Sindh. 750, to be fair, there was an uprising in the making for 30 years. 30 years, there was an uprising in the making, and that uprising was engineered, and it was built up by another sub-tribe of the Quraysh. And they were, you could say, a lesser tribe of the Quraysh. They didn't have as much prestige as the Banu Umayyah did, Banu Abbas. So really the family of our Prophet ﷺ, his tribe and his clan. And they were people who claimed to be, well, they were actually descendants of Abbas radiallahu an, Ibn Abbas radiallahu an, and then from his progeny. And they took charge in the year 750. Now, the Abbasids were in charge from 750 all the way till the year 1258. But the problem is, their rule can be split up into two effective periods. Number one is their period of what we call executive sovereignty, and number two is theoretical sovereignty. Executive meaning you actually have the power in your hands, you wield the power, you can call the shots. Theoretical sovereignty is you're there just as a titular figurehead. I mean, you're there, they call you the caliph, but in reality you have no power. Power has been invested into the hands of other dynasties, as in the case of the Abbasids. So the Abbasids came into charge 750. In 819, yes brother.
Just a quick question, and then I'm just going to head home just to pray some Quran, just as a rest. I just wrote it while you were talking.
Yeah.
I was trying to learn while you were talking. I had this question, but I feel I'm ready to ask the question. If interpretation of the Quran is for Allah only, since it is His words, so there are some ulama that say some angels or higher angels that would question Allah not out of pride but only to learn more. So if Jibreel only talked to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and we believe in all the prophets, then surely this is true, no?
Good question. I think it's a bit of a loaded question. I don't think I'm having to juggle a few things at the moment. So if I can just put that on hold, and then maybe later on, we've got plenty of learned scholars here, so you can inshallah approach them. But I appreciate you coming. Jazakumullah. Jazakumullah. Okay, so carrying on, 750 the Abbasids come into power. Now, realistically speaking, the Abbasids only had what we call executive sovereignty from 750 all the way till 862. And in 862, what happened was the Abbasids, they needed to outsource their army because they couldn't trust their own soldiers, believe it or not. They were susceptible to treachery, and their allegiances could change. So the Abbasids started to outsource their army, and they they enslaved, or they bought slaves from the Central Asian regions, and they were known as Mamluk slaves. Mamluk literally means a slave. So their elite guard now comprised of Turkic slaves. Now, quickly, so I can make this distinction, there is a difference between Turkic and Turkish. So let's draw that distinction. Turkish, anything to do with post-1924, after the Republic of Turkey was created by Ataturk. That's what you call Turkish, to do with the nation state of Turkey, not to do with the ethnicity. When we talk about Turkic, we're talking about people who ethnically originated from the Central Asian steppes. And we mean, just think of it as the Stan countries. So Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, Turkmenistan, the old regions of Turkestan before the Russians took over. So that's the distinction that we need to make. So these were Turkic tribes, not from modern day Turkey. Because at that time, Turkey, known as Anatolia, Asia Minor, was in the hands of the Byzantines. Muslims hadn't even stepped foot there. Muslims won't step foot in Anatolia until roughly around 1060, 1071. So let's put Turkey, the country, to one side. Let's focus on the Turkic ethnic group, so those tribes. So they were now enlisted by the Abbasids as their new elite slave guard and their slave corps. Now, if you've noticed, I've jumped one date in the middle. That's 819. Here we're introduced to one of the first sub-dynasties of the Abbasids, called the Samanids. And remember, like we said, the Abbasids started to lose power. They started to lose executive power and be reduced to just a theoretical sovereign state. Meaning people just recognized them as the caliphs, but that was it. They didn't have to go through them to get authorization or permission. And one major contributing factor was in the West and in the East, people before who were lands that were once under the Umayyads. Remember, like we said last week, it's a fantasy to believe that Muslims have been united from the time of the Prophet all the way up until 1924, and only in the last 100 years have we been disunited. That date, 750, is so important. Keep it in the back of your mind. From 750 onwards, the Muslims have never, ever, ever been united under one political entity. Never. All of the lands that were Muslim lands, Muslim majority lands, under the Umayyads, were all under the Umayyads. They all saw the Umayyads as the rulers. When it came to 750, as soon as the Abbasids took power, as soon as the Abbasids took office, then the first land to break away was Spain, and it became an Umayyad emirate. So now Spain, which was once under the Umayyads, now becomes separate. The Abbasids have zero control there. And that's a recurring theme. It was like a domino effect. So it started in Spain. Then after that, the North African countries, Tunisia, Morocco, Algeria, Egypt, they all slowly started to fall. And you now had independent rulers. Some of these rulers said, right, we're going to rule independently, but we're still going to acknowledge the Abbasids. Some, like the Ismaili Shi'as, say, we don't even acknowledge the Abbasids as legitimate rulers. We're going to form our own counter-caliphate. And that's exactly what you had in North Africa. So in North Africa, you had the Arabs and the Berber dynasties, who then wanted to have their own independence. Berber people are the indigenous local people of Morocco, of Al-Maghrib, as we call it. That's what was happening in the West. In the East, at the same time, you had these Turkic groups who started to gain land for themselves. Now, the reason why I mentioned Samanids is because it's not as easy as just find a slave and, where are you going to find a whole slave army from? We're not talking about going to the slave market and the slave dealer and buying 1 or 2 slaves for your own personal use at home. We're talking about an entire army, an entire well-trained, fully equipped military force. And where do you get that from? This is where the Samanids come in. So the Samanids in 819, they were a Persian group. And the leader was somebody known as Saman Khuda. So he converted to Islam in the year 819. He had 4 sons. And the Abbasid Caliph at that time, he recognized that his 4 sons had political potential. So what he did was, the Abbasid Caliph. Now, sometimes as a leader, you have to delegate. You can't take too much yourself, otherwise you'll overload. You'll be overwhelmed. So he delegated a few lands in Central Asia, the Stan countries, to these 4 sons of Saman Khuda. That now gave rise to the Samanid Empire, the Samanid dynasty. The Samanid dynasty saw themselves still as subjects of the Abbasids. They never saw themselves as a breakaway empire. We still pledge our loyalty with the Abbasids. And historically speaking, if you ever wanted to break away from the caliphate, all you had to do was 2 things. Number 1, stop mentioning the name of the caliph in the Friday sermons, number 1. And then that will really put you on the radar of the caliphate. And number 2 was stop minting coins with the caliph's name on it. If you did those 2 things, then you're effectively declaring war on the caliphate because you don't acknowledge them as your leader. So the Samanids didn't do those 2. They still mentioned the Abbasid Caliph in their sermons, and they still minted coins in commemoration of the Abbasid Caliph. So they became now the defenders of the Abbasid Caliphate. And they were the ones who actually sourced these Turkic tribes, these Turkic tribal regiments, and directed them towards the Abbasids. Here's your slave army. So they were the suppliers, if you want to call it that. The Abbasids were the consumers and the Samanids were the suppliers. Yeah? Now bear with me, it seems like we've gone on a bit of a tangent, but we'll reel ourselves back in 977, you can see that. So, funnily enough, this slave force that the Abbasids had enlisted actually revolted and deposed the Abbasid ruler in 862. That's where you've got the Mamluk mutiny. This is when the period of theoretical sovereignty begins. The Abbasid Caliph was just a figurehead. The Abbasid Caliph was now just a prisoner in his own palace. He held no effective executive rule or executive power. Who was calling the shots? The Mamluk commander. The Mamluk commander later on gave himself the name Amirul Umara, so the commander of the commanders. So he now calls the shots. He is now the ruler. In 945, the Abbasids' problems were only compounded when a Shia state, initially they were 5 Shi'as, meaning they subscribed to a version of Shi'ism which held that there were 5 imams, 5 infallible imams. The Shia belief holds 5 imams who have a connection with the Prophet and they have divine abilities. They believed in the 5 sect of Shi'ism, known as the Zaydis. and later on they converted to Twelverism, to Twelver Shi'ism. They originated in Isfahan, modern-day Iran, and they swept across the entire east and ended up taking Baghdad. So now they've captured Baghdad. Now imagine, as a Sunni caliphate, a Shia state, a Shia group, a Shia empire have now taken control of your capital. And the thing about the Buyids is, and this is what earned them a bit of stick, this is why they were criticized among Shia circles, because the Buyids didn't actually depose the Abbasids. The Buyids, they were quite pragmatic, so they were quite practical thinkers. They thought, if we take off the Abbasid Caliph, there's going to be a massive uproar in the Sunni world, so let's keep the Abbasid Caliph in his place, but again, who's going to call the shots? We will. So the Abbasid Caliph, again, he's just a figurehead. So he just holds a ceremonial position. We are the ones calling the shots. So 945. Now, the Abbasids are effectively held captives in their own palaces. This is when we move to now 977. This is now when we talk about the Ghaznavids. Where did the Ghaznavids come from? The Ghaznavids, has anybody heard of that word, Ghaznavid? Have you ever come across anything along the same lines? Sultan Mahmud Ghaznavi. Yeah, so everybody's heard of him. This is going to be his origin story now. We're talking about the Samanids. Samanids themselves, now imagine, we're supplying slave soldiers to the to the Abbasids. I mean, why don't we take on a few of our own slave soldiers? So they started to recruit slave generals. And in 962, one of the slave generals, called Abu Ishaq, he'd been appointed by the Samanid Sultan, by the Samanid leader, to govern a province of modern-day Afghanistan known as Ghazna or Ghazni. So that's where the name comes from. So 962. Now, Abu Ishaq had a son. His son was called Sabuktajin. They were both Turkic tribal members. They were both Turks. The Samanids were Persians. And just keep this in your mind. Across our Muslim history, you've always had three main characters. Muslim characters, Muslim heroes, Muslim protagonists. Number one, obviously the Arabs. Number two, the Persians. And number three, the Turks. Turks, Turkic, not Turkish. The Persians have always been the classy, sophisticated, cultured elite. They're the ones who were the governors and the administrators and the bureaucrats. They were the politicians, because they were now an extension of the old Persian Sassanid Empire. The same Sassanid Empire that was brought down by the rightly guided caliphs. So they were the ruling elite. And they then hired the Turks as their enforcers, as their guns for hire, as their mercenaries. So Abu Ishaq and Sabuktajin, they were both slave generals. Now 962, Abu Ishaq got a bit ahead of himself. And he became a bit ambitious. He thought, I'm in charge here in Ghazni, why don't I try to gain my independence? Let me try and break away from the Samanids and start my own breakaway state. That's what he tried to do. So he initiated a failed, albeit it was a failed coup d'etat. So coup meaning just uprising. And it failed, 962. And they were then classed as outcasts. They were now social pariahs. They were outcasts now from the Samanids. But they still let Sabuktajin rule in Ghazni. Abu Ishaq passed away. And when it came to slave dynasties, their choice of succession wasn't, my son's going to rule. Their choice of succession was, the slave soldiers gather, and whoever they deem the most fit and the most suitable to carry on the legacy of the empire, they'll be selected and appointed as a new leader. So Sabuktajin, just because he's the son of Abu Ishaq, doesn't mean he's now going to become the next leader. So a council was convened, and unsurprisingly, they chose Sabuktajin, because he was the most qualified from them all. He now, in 977, becomes the leader of this branch of governors in modern-day Afghanistan, Ghazni. His ambitions now get the better of him. Once he sees the loyalty, the die-hard loyalty that his subjects are willing to give him, and how his subjects are willing to sacrifice their lives for him, and his soldiers are completely allied with his cause, he thinks, okay, now maybe I can try attempt number 2 at breaking away from the Samanids. And he tried, and he was successful. That's when, 977, the Ghaznavid state now commences. Why they call the Ghaznavids? Because they hailed from Ghazni in Afghanistan. From 977, now all the way up until 998, Sabuktajin was in charge. And he made excursions into Afghanistan. Some eastern provinces came under his rule. Eastern provinces, we're talking about Iran and modern-day Iraq. And they were really at a strategic location because they were situated in the Afghan highlands. And Afghan highlands meaning the mountains. If you're in the mountains, you're untouchable. Like the Taliban today, for 20 years, when the NATO forces were trying to suppress them, they just retreated to the mountains, and they were untouchable. Mountainous, rugged terrain, nobody can get there. It's inaccessible. And that's actually been a trope. That's actually been a reoccurring motif and theme across Muslim history. All the Afghani rulers and dynasties, they've all strategically placed themselves in the highlands so that they're inaccessible. So they're not impervious to outside influence and outside rule. Ghaznavids started this tradition. So Sabuktigin, he did focus his attention slightly. He made a few raids into the subcontinent, but nothing substantial. Now comes his son. His son is the face of the Ghaznavids, and his son is Sultan Mahmud Ghaznavi. Household name, everybody's heard of him. Sultan Mahmud Ghaznavi. He now ascends to the throne meaning metaphorically, in 998. If you just go to the next slide. Right, so now this is Sultan Mahmud Ghaznavi's exploits. Ghaznavids, their territory, that's modern day Afghanistan. You can see there the Buyids on the left hand side. The Buyids were who? Shi'as, and they'd taken control of Baghdad. That's Iraq. That you can see Basra, Iraq. You can see Baghdad there. That's Buyid territory. Then you can see just bottom right here, you've got Rajaputna, and that's modern day Rajasthan in India. You can see that you've got Daebul. You can see just a small blip, bottom right. What did we say Daebul was? Modern day Karachi, the modern day port town of Karachi. So that's the Sindh region there. And you can see the Indus River, just slightly here, if I can just point it out. You can see Indus here. So the Indus River, the Indus Valley, is the river which Muhammad ibn Qasim crossed. And that's why he begun his expedition, conquest against Raja Dahir, the Sindhis. Mahmud Ghaznavi ascends the throne now. And remember, these Turkic slaves, Mahmud Ghaznavi, he didn't want to earn the wrath of the Abbasids. He always saw himself as a subject of the Abbasids, just like the Samanids. So he's inherited that tradition. We're not a breakaway state. We still acknowledge the reputation and respect of the Abbasids. So he was loyal to them. That's why the Caliph Al-Qadir, he actually conferred the title Yameen al-Dawla to Mahmud Ghaznavi. Now he has been given official authority and permission from the Abbasids. Yameen al-Dawla means the right hand of the state. Right hand signifying power. So he is now the enforcer of the state. And the Abbasids always had to outsource their military. And when you read history from 862 onwards, I've always wondered myself, where on earth did the Abbasid field army go? The Abbasids must have had their own army. Where on earth did they go? Well, the answer is they were completely useless. The Abbasid standing army, and they had a standing army and a field army, they were rendered completely impotent. They couldn't do anything. They were an outdated force. That's why they had to enlist the help of Turkic groups. And that continues all the way up until their demise as well. One of the Turkic groups that the Abbasid had enlisted to fight for their cause were actually the progenitors. They were the predecessors of the Ottomans, modern day Ottomans. And that's another reoccurring theme. The Turks, the Turkic people, have always been the defenders of Islam. It was just in their nature, it's in their blood to be the defenders of Sunni Islam. And they've always been. It started with the Ghaznavids here. Yameen al-Dawla. That means he can now, if you've been given a title by the Abbasid Caliph, it wasn't just, right, you've got a title, happy days, that's it. It doesn't mean anything. It did mean something, and it meant something important. If you were given a title by the Abbasid Caliph, that means he's now giving you permission to wage wars in the name of not Abbasids, not of the Abbasids, but in the name of Islam. So any war that you carried out was now pure jihad, striving in the path of Allah. So Mahmud Ghaznavi, Yameen al-Dawla now. And that name, Yameen al-Dawla, that title was given to the entire Ghaznavid dynasty. Now his first order of business was to depose the Buyids. Obviously, as a defender of Sunni Islam, Shi'as were the main threat. So he had to counteract that threat from the Shi'as. So he made his push into northern Afghanistan, into Iran. He actually ousted the Buyids from a city in Iran known as Ray. He didn't actually get as far as Baghdad. So he didn't actually manage to depose them from Baghdad itself, but he did contribute a lot to the Sunni cause. Now his attention was diverted away from, this is the Eastern Front. His attention was diverted away from the Eastern Front to the Western Front. Because in Multan, a modern day province of Pakistan, you had another sect, another Shia sect called the Ismailis. The Ismailis were another Shia dynasty. They were a counter-caliphate in Egypt. Their base was in Cairo. Does anybody know, obviously I'm sure the respective ulama will know the Arabic name for Cairo? Al-Qahira. Al-Qahira, the victorious, the conqueror. It wasn't actually called that from before. The Ismaili sect, sect and the state started in modern day North Africa, Tunisia or Morocco, in that region. And they made their push eastwards. Cairo was actually under the control of the Tulunids. The Tulunids were the descendants of Ahmad ibn Tulun, and early on, he was an Arab. And he said to the Abbasid Caliph, give me the region of Cairo, I'll administer it for you, but I'll still be loyal to the Abbasids. So now you've got a breakaway state, well, semi-autonomous, semi-independent state, the Tulunids. In 969 roughly, so all of these things are now intersecting. In 969, the Fatimids, they're known as the Fatimids, the Ismaili Fatimids. Why are they called the Fatimids? Because they trace their lineage back to Fatima radiallahu anha. In actual fact, the historicity, meaning the historical authenticity of that lineage back to Fatima radiallahu anha, is fake. It was just a political ploy, just so that they could give themselves some legitimacy. Now, if somebody comes along and says, hey, follow my new state, who are you, where have you come from, we don't even know you. If somebody comes and says, follow my new movement, who are you? Well, I'm a descendant of Fatima radiallahu anha, from the Ahlul Bayt, from the family of the Prophet. Now that's some political clout and weight behind your movement. So they made their march 969 and they captured Al-Qahira. They now captured Cairo. And Al-Azhar University was actually established and instituted by the Ismailis, the Ismaili Shias, the famous bastion of Sunni learning. Al-Azhar University started off as an Ismaili missionary center. It started off as a mosque, Al-Azhar Mosque. Let's have an adjacent center where we can produce these Ismaili da'is and missionaries, and we can send them out across the Sunni world to spread our false ideologies and deviant ideas. So now you've got two oppositions, Shia oppositions. The Ismailis, they had managed to convert and win over the governor of Multan. So he now became an Ismaili. So Mahmud of Ghazni turned his attention and attacked his forces in Multan, modern day Pakistan. And that's how he earned the title of the defender of Sunni Islam. That was his first exposure to modern day, you can say, subcontinent. Then he started branching out more and more eastwards into modern day India. Now, in the year 1001, he actually vowed, he made an oath that I swear by, whatever he took an oath by, I swear by, let's say Allah, I'm going to expand Muslim territory into India at least once a year, and I'm going to invite the locals to Islam. That's the year 1001. He continued for the next roughly 27 years, up until his death in around 1030. And he executed 17 raids. When we say raids, we mean they were quite deadly and devastating raids into India. And that brought him much wealth and power. And where was the capital of the Ghaznavid state? It's in the name. Ghazna, modern day Afghanistan. Now, Sultan Mahmud of Ghazni, he wanted to have a staging ground, a frontal command center from where he could direct his attacks into modern day India. And he chose none other than modern day Lahore. He chose modern day Lahore to be his frontal HQ and command post. And that was given the name of Mahmudpur, so the city of Mahmud. Later on it was dubbed as the mini Ghazna or mini Ghazni. So he staged all of his attacks from there. And now this is where the waters are murkied a little bit, where they're maybe muddied slightly. Sultan Mahmud of Ghazni is, you could say, a predecessor of Aurangzeb. Not in terms of lineage, not in terms of politics, but in terms of modern day sentiment. Now the main criticism leveled against Aurangzeb is he was racist against Hindus. And he was a genocidal maniac. He was a despot. All of his policies were against Hindus. That's the criticism leveled against Aurangzeb. The same criticism is leveled against Mahmud of Ghazni, that he was a tyrannical ruler and his only ambition was to stamp out Hinduism from the Indian subcontinent. Now, if you look at the facts do seem to support this. Just hold on. The facts and statistics do seem to support this. He destroyed dozens of temples. He plundered and pilfered and desecrated Hindu shrines. He destroyed idols as well. And he brought back millions and millions of gold coins and gold dinars from these temples, from these shrines. And the most famous one is actually in Gujarat. In 1026, he destroyed and desecrated the main temple of Shiva in Somnath, which is in Gujarat, 1026. Completely razed it to the ground. And he actually took back 20 million gold coins in spoils of war, back to his capital in Ghazni. This is where we now have to put our historical caps on and assess the information. Not based on the facts, but based on the wider context. Remember, and this is so important, you have to keep this in mind. You have to study history not on your terms, not based on your tradition, not based on your culture, not based on the norms in today's modern day society. You have to study history based on their terms, based on the culture and the tradition and the societal norms of the people you're studying. Now, it'd be foolish for me to criticize Sultan Mahmud of Ghazni based on, let's say, the Geneva Conventions or United Nations laws from today, because they didn't exist then. So you have to really put your historical cap on and look at everything, bring it together, and then analyze the facts. The first problem is, Sultan Mahmud of Ghazni, there are a lot of myths and apocrypha. Apocrypha just means those stories which have been exaggerated or made up. There's a lot of apocrypha surrounding Mahmud of Ghazni. And this really struck me. And when I read this, I thought, hang on a second, I've gone through 6-7 years of training in a traditional institute. Why have I never heard of this before? And as somebody from Gujarat, as an Indian, why have I never heard of this before? Like, for example, we're all from the subcontinent here. Has anybody ever heard of that king, Jaraman Perumal, the first companion? Nobody's ever heard of him. So surely there must be something wrong with his story, with his backstory. The same thing with Mahmud of Ghazni. And this is just ridiculous, but I mean, it's out there. During the time of the Prophet ﷺ, some Arab chroniclers, Muslim historians, what they've tried to do is they've tried to back project history. So people who are writing about Mahmud of Ghazni centuries after he came, and they tried to make Mahmud of Ghazni look like somebody who was out for blood, out for Hindu blood. And his only ambition, his only goal in India was to efface Hinduism, just get rid of it from the face of this earth. Now that Mahmud of Ghazni never said that. If you look at Mahmud of Ghaznavi's policies, nowhere has he mentioned that. So this has been imposed on him. Now there might be a little bit of truth to that, but it's not the full truth, it's not the entire story. So Somnath, some people have said it comes from the Arabic word Manat. Manat being one of the main idols and deities worshipped in ancient pre-Islamic days in Arabia. Now the story goes that the Prophet ﷺ sent Ali radiallahu anh in the 8th year after migration to take out and destroy this idol Manat. The Arabs in Mecca, they caught whiff of this, so they actually shipped off Manat, meaning the actual idol, the actual shrine of Manat, shipped it off to Gujarat, so it could be stored for safekeeping and out of the hands of the Muslims there. Now when the Prophet found out about this, he prophesied. He said, somebody will come from the progeny of the Muslims called Mahmud, and he will one day destroy Manat, and he will one day conquer India. Now, when it comes to the prophecies that the Prophet had ever given out, one, you could say, general rule of thumb to gauge whether it's true or not is how specific it is. Now, if it's too specific, like this, Mahmud, somebody like Mahmud who's going to come and he's going to conquer India and he's going to destroy Manat, if it's too specific, then you can well imagine it's a false ascription to the Prophet ﷺ. It's just false attribution. Somebody who was writing from after Mahmud's time, who wants to give Mahmud some legitimacy, so let's say that his mission was sanctioned and prophesied by the Prophet. So that's completely false, completely baseless. That's something you have to bear in mind. We'll get to this later on, because temple desecration is quite a hot topic nowadays. So we'll get to that later on towards the end. So why did Mahmud of Ghazni actually make all of these 17 raids into India? Now remember, history is not black and white. It's not, you had the evil people and you had the good people. You had the forces of evil and the forces of good. There's one historian, modern day historian, Muslim convert. He said that if you approach history trying to find he was bad, he was good, he was evil, he was religious, then you have a childish outlook on history, because history is one big grey area. It's not linear. It's not just, okay, these are the facts, straight facts, and it's very simple. Now you can make your judgment call. There are so many things you have to take into consideration. When we talk about Mahmud of Ghaznavi's raised into India, we have to take into consideration quite a few things. Number one is, okay, he might have been spurred on, and it's a possibility that he was spurred on by the ambition and desire to expand the Muslim reigns and to expand the Muslim kingdom, which is fair enough. That well and truly could have been, was actually one of his ambitions. However, like any politician, and this is one thing you have to keep in mind, you know, caliphs and sultans and governors, at the end of the day, what were they? They were politicians at the end of the day. So if you see the politicians out there today, then do they live up to their campaign slogans? Do they always go by the book? Are their hands always squeaky clean? Do they always have scrupulous dealings? No. Because that's the reality of politics. You have to get your hands dirty sometimes. So Mahmud al-Ghaznavi was a politician. You can't say that he was a religious, devout Muslim who was pushed and driven just by Islam. That was a factor. But he was also driven by politics and by finance. Why finance and monetary incentives? He had a huge army. He had one of the most professional and well-equipped armies of that time. Armies don't come cheap. Where is he going to get all the money from? Well, all of these temples in India, they were then patronized and supported and backed by local leaders. And leaders would invest their wealth in all of these temples. Now, when you talk about Hindu gods and idols, I don't mean a small clay statue or an idol made of mud. I'm talking about pure gold. Pure gold encrusted with diamonds and jewels and expensive embroidery. These are the types of idols that were housed in temples. And these weren't any old temples. These are what you call state-backed temples, state-approved temples. We'll talk about it later on, but just to introduce the idea. Now, best source of money, spoils of war, where can you get it from? Get it from these temples. And to clear up something else, according to Islamic law, technically speaking, if you're a sultan, if you've been given legitimate power to carry out raids and conquest in the name of the Muslim caliph, in the name of Islam, any resources that come into your power will now be classed as ghanima, meaning spoils of war. And that's permissible for you. And the lands that you conquer are now at the discretion of the leader. He can do whatever he wishes, technically speaking, legally speaking. Now, law is filled with technicality. So technically speaking, that's what you can do. You can do whatever you want. I can walk into, as a leader, Mahmud al-Ghaznavi could have destroyed anything and everything in his path because he owns it now. Because he's taken control, he can own it. Historically speaking, what have the Muslims done? They haven't done that. And they've been quite pragmatic. So they've actually taken into consideration the sensitivities and the culture of the local people. So that's now become the norm, where you don't go around destroying religious places of worship. And the benchmark for this, Imam Rajab al-Hanbali has mentioned this in his Al-Mughni, and he's mentioned there's an ijma' as-sukuti, which is tacit consensus, meaning everybody's agreed. They've not said we agree, but they all agree based on practice, which is places of worship are to be protected, are sanctified according to Muslim law. And where does he derive that from? From an edict, an official edict given out by Umar bin Abdul Aziz. He gave out a religious decree to all of his governors saying, temples, monasteries, churches, you name it, synagogues, all of them are to be given state protection. They have to be protected based on the state. And that practice has continued and perpetuated over the ages. So that became the default. Now, people did go against the default, and it was fine because it was technically legally permitted, like Mahmud al-Ghaznavi. We can see how the monetary incentives were actually played a huge part. Now imagine 20 million gold coins just from one temple, the Somnath temple in Gujarat. That could then finance his army for years, even decades. So he was driven by that because his focus wasn't on India all the time. His focus was on who? The Buyuds. His focus was fighting against the Shia. The Indians and the Indian subcontinent in the east, I mean, he did invest a lot of time, effort and money into it, and he did want to expand the Muslim borders, but his primary focus were the Shias. Okay, so that's something you have to bear in mind. Another thing is, if you've heard of Alexander the Great, he was from Macedonia, so Eastern Europe. And roughly 400 BCE, that's when he carried out these revolutionary conquests. And he swept through the entire eastern regions, making it all the way up until India, modern-day India. Now the difference is, when he arrived at the subcontinent, he unleashed his soldiers. He let them off the hook, and they could do whatever they like. They were given amnesty. You can do what you like. You can rape, loot, pillage, destroy, kill. You won't be penalized for it. Mahmud of Ghaznavi didn't do that. He kept his soldiers in check. And there are a few royal decrees as well coming from Sultan Mahmud of Ghaznavi saying that his soldiers have to abide by decorum, and his soldiers have to abide and adhere to strict military ethics. Yeah? So he wasn't this Hindu, then genocidal maniac as people make him out to be. Okay, so I hope that's covered up. That's cleared up Sultan Mahmud of Ghaznavi. Now I have left a few holes undiscussed, and we'll talk about that later on when we come to temple desecration. Because you might say, okay, it might have been legally permitted, but how can it be morally allowed? How can somebody destroy a temple? I mean, how can you even do that? Now think about it. How would we feel if somebody comes into our hometown and destroys a mosque? Sometimes you have to put yourself into the shoes of the opposition, of the people on the other side. So how would a Hindu feel if an outsider came in and destroyed your local place of worship, your temple? Now, it's not, like we said, it's not black and white. It's not as if Hindu temple, target sighted, destroy it. Get rid of Hinduism. There were political and there were then hierarchical lenses at play here and factors at play. We'll talk about that later on. If you can move on to the next slide, please. Going on a bit of a tangent here. Slight tangent, just a few minutes. This is a coin minted by Sultan Mahmud of Ghaznavi. And really, the study of numismatics, that's a study of coinage and how coins have evolved and how coins have been minted and how coins have shaped society as well and shaped thinking. The study of numismatics. Sultan Mahmud of Ghaznavi, Muslims in general, you'll notice, they saw coins as an opportunity to spread the message of Islam. And I thought if we could just take a few minutes just to admire this masterpiece of a coin. This is a bilingual coin, which was minted by Sultan Mahmud of Ghaznavi. Minted meaning it was just created, it was just coined. And on there, on the left-hand side, what can you see? What can you make out in the middle? The kalima. You can make out the kalima in the middle. And around the side, it's hard to make out, but it just says this coin was minted by Sultan Mahmud of Ghaznavi in such and such a year, 1028. This is a coin from 1028, a silver dirham from 1028. Now, this is what you call the bilingual coin. 2 languages. So this is the front of it, and on the obverse, on the other side, you've got that. Can anyone guess what language that might be on the right-hand side? That's a good guess, yeah. And you can be mistaken for thinking that's Hindi. It's actually a historical, ancient, and quite a holy version of an older version of Hindi, Sanskrit. That is Sanskrit on the other side. Sultan Mahmud of Ghaznavi translated all of that into Sanskrit. And really, this is an amazing thing as well. The way he translated Allah. Now, Allah can't be translated. In English, we've got God. But how do you translate it into Sanskrit? And this is a Hindu language, a language which is dominated by paganism and polytheism. And this just shows farsightedness. This just shows how you can carry out da'wah wherever you are. It's not just restricted to going out in the path of Allah, although that's the best place, the most optimal. But you can carry out da'wah anywhere, from even the comfort of your home, from even minting a coin. He translated the word Allah into the invisible. There's a reason why he did that. If you're a Hindu, then all of your gods are what we call corporeal, meaning they have a physical form. You've got a Hindu, you've got your God in front of you. He's taken the form of an idol. Now when he translated Allah as the invisible, then in itself that one word was enough of a message of da'wah to convey to the people that Allah isn't like your gods. Allah can't be seen. And you can't then iconize. You can't then capture Allah into an idol. Allah is above and beyond being an idol. Allah is above and beyond being restricted to a place and time by being an idol. That's just by one word, he manages to carry out da'wah like that. And you'll be surprised. Imagine if you're a non-Muslim with that piece of information in your hand and you're reading this La ilaha illallah every day. You're going to the grocery shop buying your bread with that coin. You're going to the cobbler getting your shoes fixed with that coin. If you're exposed to that every single day, you can just imagine the psychological and subliminal impact that will have on you. And later on, you start to think, La ilaha illallah, I read it all the time. What does it actually mean? Let me find out. And it piques people's interest. That's how coins have been used across history. Okay, so I think that concludes our discussion on Sultan Mahmud Ghazni. We've got a lot more I could talk about. For example, Firdausi Shahnama, a famous poem written in Persian, dedicated to all the Persian kings, pre-Islamic and post-Islamic. And it's still studied today, actually. And the poem was actually sponsored by Sultan Mahmud Ghaznavi. Al-Biruni, who was an astrologist, he was a sociologist, he was an anthropologist, somebody who studied human behavior, somebody who studied human society. He was a scientist as well. And he made great advancements and strides in the field of astronomy and science. He was the first Muslim to study an outsider culture. When Sultan Mahmud Ghaznavi was making his incursions into India, Al-Biruni actually accompanied him. And he was there for a decade, nearly 5 decades Al-Biruni was there for. What did he do? He studied Hindu culture. Objectively. He studied it from an impartial lens. He didn't study it with any preconceived notion that these are backwards people. And I'm going to try and portray them as devilish people and demonize them. He wanted to genuinely understand them. And he wrote his groundbreaking Kitab al-Hind, which is the Book of India. And he talked about Hindu culture, Hindu language, Indian states, the caste system. He talked about everything. And that's still used as a reference today by anthropologists. So he is dubbed as the first anthropologist. Anthropologist, somebody who studies human behavior on an individual level. A sociologist, somebody who studies human behavior on a societal, communal level. So these are things that happened during Sultan Mahmud Ghaznavi's time. Anyway, bringing us to a close. He started off. He is the one that laid the foundations. Muhammad al-Qasim did, but he didn't penetrate that far into Indian land. Sultan Mahmud Ghaznavi did. And now he set a precedence for later rulers to come. In 1030 he died, and if we'll just end here. His state fell into disrepair after that, because they were now challenged by another Turkic group. Does anybody know who the Ghaznavids were challenged by later on? The Sufa boy should know. The Seljuks. The Seljuks. They were the predecessors of the Ottomans. They're the ones that paved the way for the Ottomans. They were the ones that captured Anatolia. They defeated the Byzantines, and they allowed the Ottomans to now flourish as small kingdoms in Anatolia, in Turkey early on. So anyway, after 1030, they fell off the radar, the Ghaznavids, and they started to fall off the political scene. So their height, their peak, their zenith was achieved by Sultan Mahmud al-Ghaznavi. Right. Hopefully, we can get this done in 5 minutes. Temple desecration. Destroying temples, destroying idols, removing idols. Muslims have done it in the past, and we're not going to cower away from that. We're not going to hide. You have to, remember, when it comes to history, you have to own your narrative. How can you own your narrative? You have to empower yourself with knowledge. That's where education comes in. I can't sit here attempting to defend Sultan Mahmud Ghaznavi if I don't know anything about him. If I don't know about the policy, if I don't know about the cultural climate of that time. And remember, not that we won't defend him, but I'm not obliged to defend him. If he carried out wrongs, we put our hands up and we say he carried out wrongs. If you have a look at the early Arabic books on history, the chronicles, for example, you've got Imam Tabari, you've got Khalifa ibn Khayyat, you've got Al-Baladhuri's Futuh al-Buldan, all of these different books, early Arabic books on Muslim history. They are the most objective books you can find out there. They don't hide anything. If a sultan committed atrocities, they'll mention it. They're not going to hide it, like modern textbooks try to do. If they destroyed temples, they're going to write down they destroyed temples. It's only later on when people started to doctor and change history to suit their own narrative, to suit their own agendas. And if people are looking for an academic article for this, now I was trying to grapple with this, and it's quite a difficult topic to think about as well, temple desecrations. And you realize how sensitive it is and how emotional it is and how emotionally charged it is if you put yourself in a Hindu person's shoes. Now imagine, just a lay Hindu person. I'm not talking about the people that are pulling the strings from the top. Normal Hindu. You're told by your local MP in India, Muslims destroyed temples. How would you feel about that? Imagine if your local Muslim MP said, Hindus destroyed mosques. A mosque is a bastion of faith. It's got to be a mosque till the end of times. A mosque holds significance in a Muslim's heart. Obviously, we'd feel heart-wrenched and we'd feel some anger. So you can understand why it's a sensitive issue. And everything was quite blurry until I came across an amazing piece of academic work by Richard Eaton. He's written a book called, not written a book, sorry. He's got an article in the Islamic Journal of India, I think it's called. You can search it online. Richard Eaton, Temple Desecration. in Indo-Muslim history. And literally, that's he has 8 chapters. And he'd answer a question, then he'd answer a question, an objection, then he'd pose another question, and I think, oh no, I've just got myself embroiled into another battle of mental gymnastics, trying to figure out how to understand this from a Muslim point of view. Next chapter, he'd answer it. Same thing, next chapter, he'd answer it. Now the thing is, he's not a Muslim. He's not even an Indian. He's a professor from America. Now, this is what you call objectivity. Now, he has no incentives to back and favor Islam. None whatsoever. So studies like this are invaluable. Because people can't see, hang on, he's prone to faith bias. I mean, if a Muslim wrote defending temple desecration, they're going to say, well, you're a Muslim, obviously you're going to defend it. This is a non-Muslim. So I've summarized his points. He has a 40-page long article, summarized into a few points. Number 1 is, the picture that Muslim states across history, really he focuses on the period of 1192 to 1700, so to Mughal times. However, it can be, he said himself, you can extend it to pre-1192, and really after 1700s, not much was carried out. The picture that Muslims indiscriminately targeted temples. The picture that Muslims walked into a town, find the temples, destroy them. He's saying that. And the pictures of wanton destruction and plundering can't be sustained by primary evidence. There's no evidence to suggest that Muslims wanted to destroy everything, all traces of Hinduism. That's number 1. No evidence. And he's talking about not evidence from last decade or last century, primary evidence from the 1200s, eyewitness accounts. And he says now, and this is interesting, Hindu nationalists, they estimate, the figure they give, 60,000 temples have been destroyed over the course of Indo-Muslim history, meaning whenever Muslims have interacted with Indians. Do you know how many Richard Eaton? He says those events, those occasions where we can say for sure, based on primary, secondary evidence, eyewitness accounts, we've got archaeological evidence to back it up. How many instances can we narrow it down to? 80. Now you can see how the figure of 80 has been blown out of proportion to 60,000. Where on earth did that come from? 60,000. Now the thing is, the Hindu nationalists haven't taken it from, they haven't plucked it from thin air. They've got it from somewhere. And a lot of that information, a problem with Hindu historians, nationalist historians. Remember, we're not attacking Hindus. Our problem is with the nationalists, the Hindu nationalists. A lot of their information to do with temple desecration comes from 2 types of poetry. They're called epics and counter-epics. An epic is a poem which shows valor and bravery and courage. A counter-epic is a poem which shows bravery and courage in the face of oppression. So it's a poem which is glorifying resistance. So these poems, epics and counter-epics, were written during post-Ghaznavid times by Muslim historians and Hindu historians. Way after Mahmud of Ghazni. So Muslim historians were writing epics and Hindu historians were writing counter-epics. And obviously in poetry, people like to exercise their poetic license, meaning they like to stretch the facts a bit, and for aesthetic purposes, so it rhymes and so it sounds nice, we can stretch the truth a little bit. And that's what all poetry is. That's where poetic license comes from. So a lot of these figures have been taken from not just Hindu counter-epics, from Muslim epics. So now you're thinking, why on earth would a Muslim historian say, I mean, they brag, Muslim epics brag about destroying, that Mahmud of Ghazni destroyed such and such a number of temples. Why would they do that? Well, a lot of these people are, you wouldn't say fanatics, but they're people who were a bit too overcharged when it came to the Muslim-Hindu clash. They wanted to show that the earlier sultans, they were all about destroying Hinduism. So they ascribed all of these completely nonsensical statistics. Like some of them were saying Mahmud of Ghazni destroyed thousands of temples. That's just completely false, completely baseless. That can't be substantiated anywhere. So a lot of these numbers, the Hindu historians take face value from the Muslim epics. Yeah, so you have to understand the sources of history. This is a problem as well. You can't just go into Waterstones or a bookshop, book of history, then you pick it up and read it, and take everything as the gospel. because it's not. People always have agendas. The best books to read about history, and I know people ask about this, so we might have a slide right at the end of the last session on further reading. But the two main books that I would suggest to everybody to read on history, number one, Lost Islamic History. You can't be a history enthusiast without having read that, by Firas al-Khatib, or in English. Number two is Luqman Naji's Islamic Dynasties, and I think you've got both books there on that bookshelf. So next time you come in, have a read. Now when it comes to further studies, you have specialists in each field, academic specialists from universities. Their works are probably the most credible. And obviously you have to be careful with taking conclusions from a non-Muslim about Muslim history. Obviously they're going to be prone to a certain level of bias as well, but the academic rigor that they're involved in is unmatched to an extent. And I'm talking about accessible. You've got lots in Arabic, you've got lots in Urdu, but I'm talking about here, the modern historians, they take from a wide array of sources. They don't look at just Muslim sources, they look at Hindu sources as well. So they take into consideration everything. They lay out everything and then come to their conclusion. So remember he said, indiscriminate destruction of temples can't be substantiated by evidence. There's no evidence to suggest that. However, we don't deny that temples were destroyed. What we have to do is, this is your favorite word. As somebody studying history, your favorite word should be contextualization. You have to contextualize everything, meaning put everything in its correct context. The social context, the environment they were living in, the politics they had to deal with, the issues they had to face, the challenges they encountered, because everybody goes through a problem differently. So it's unfair to then treat them and study them based on your own modern standards whilst overlooking the problems they faced, which we might not understand, but you have to try to understand them. If we contextualize temple destruction, one thing will become completely clear, crystal clear, which is temple destruction was a highly selective operation. It wasn't as if Muslims entered into a town and destroyed everything in sight, because there are reports that clearly show you've got the smaller village temples that were left untouched, unmolested. Nothing happened to them. But the state-sponsored temples, they were the subject of desecration. So now I'm sure you can now start to put the pieces together. State-sponsored, to do with the state. So the reason why they had to deal with and desecrate or redefine or actually build a mosque on top of that temple was to detach the idea of rulership. A local Hindu ruler would then give his 100% support and backing to a temple. That temple would have a house called the womb chamber. In that womb chamber of a state temple, you'd have a state deity or a state god. That state god was seen as the co-ruler of that Hindu region. And that Hindu temple, that Hindu god will be picked up and there will be processions and it will be paraded in the streets to show that the Hindu ruler has the backing of this Hindu god. This Hindu god and the Hindu ruler share political authority. So as long as the Hindu ruler is here, or as long as the state god's there, then Hindus will always be the rulers. Now you can imagine, if you're a Muslim entering, you've defeated the local Hindu ruler, but there's always a chance that they might uprise and rise up against your political authority because the temple's still standing. They'll see that idol and that state deity as a symbol of hope, that we can still regain some of our past glory. We can still then rebuild the Hindu state. So in order to completely detach the ideas of Hindu rule, the state temple had to be dealt with. It was as simple as that. So it wasn't as if they were out to get Hindus or they had an agenda against temples. It was simply to disassociate political authority with a highly charged monument, meaning a temple. Simple as that. Once you've understood that, then you can now contextualize. Now you've understood temple desecration. Now, that's not to say that all temples were destroyed because of this reason. There must have been people who destroyed it out of hatred for the Hindus, out of an ambition to Islamize or to bring Islam and remove polytheism. There must have been. But the main sultan, a majority of them, this was the reason. It was a political motive. Yeah, so I hope that makes sense now. And I hope that's contextualized it. Yeah, so now this reigns true for Aurangzeb. Yeah, the temples he did destroy were part of this. Now you'd be surprised, Aurangzeb, in a royal edict to Benares, to the region of Benares in modern day India, he actually told his governors, make sure you maintain the temple. Make sure no harm comes to the temple. There were some rebels running amok in that region. He said, make sure they can't touch the temple. Why? Now, we're not going to say it was because he wanted to promote religious freedom. We're not going to say that, because that's a modern term. The reason why he did that was because if you as a leader can maintain the local temple, then whose vote have you won, in essence? The local Hindus. They see you as a protector of their religion. So there are always going to be political angles to analyze here. One last point as well, before we just quickly move on. It wasn't as if the Muslims were the first people to destroy and desecrate temples because of political reasons. That was carried out all the way as early as the 6th century. That was a Hindu custom. The Hindus did that to each other. The Hindus destroyed each other's state temples. The Muslims were simply conforming to a local custom, the local political custom. Because you can't rule another people on your terms, because they'll just rebel. They're thinking, hang on a second, we've been doing something like this for so many years. That's our culture. It's ingrained within us now. And who are you to come and introduce something new? So you have to win your votaries and your adherents. That's what the Muslims did. They had to oblige by the local culture if they were to get anywhere politically in India. So I hope that makes sense, and I hope that's cleared up everything. Now, it might not provide all the answers you're looking for. Maybe specific scenarios might still be quite hazy. Some questions might still be left unanswered, but those are some guidelines, some major principles, which can then pretty much answer most of the objections that are leveled against the Muslims. Okay, and that's just a masterpiece of history. And each empire, each dynasty had their own coinage like that. The Abbasids, the Umayyads, actually where Muslim coinage came from, that's a completely another story for another day as well. But it links in with da'wah as well, how they use the coin to promote Islam. If you can carry on, please. Okay. Right. We talked about the Ghaznavids. This is the last dynasty up until the Mughals. They're called the Delhi Sultanate. Why they call the Delhi Sultanate? Because they took Delhi as their capital. So, the Ghaznavids, when did they... Okay, who initiated the Ghaznavids? Who is the founder of the Ghaznavid dynasty? Abu Ishaq's son. Sabuktajin. And which year was that in? 977. They managed to, I don't know how, it was a miracle that they even managed to last all the way up until 1186. The Ghaznavids lasted up until 1186. In 1186, as the natural course of life dictates, a new people, a more powerful people will rise up and depose the weaker ones, depose the weaklings. And remember, like we said, straight after Mahmud's death, the Ghaznavid state already plummeted into decline. And 1186, they now had a small piece of land. So, a new people, a new Afghani empire rose from the highland of Afghanistan called the Ghurids. The Ghurids. So they came around, they defeated the Ghaznavids, and now they are in charge of Ghazna. They're in charge of the previous provinces and territory of the Ghaznavids. The Ghaznavids, at their demise, didn't have that much land under their name anyway. So the Ghurids still had a bit of work to do, but now the main Ghaznavid territories under their control. So the first, or the most important Ghurid leader was Mu'izzuddin Ghuri. And in 1192, he actually made his way into Delhi. He captured Delhi. Now, one thing you have to note, Muhammad ibn al-Qasim, not even that, before him, the three brothers from Thaqif, Muhammad ibn al-Qasim, the Ghaznavids, the Delhi Sultanate, or the Ghaznavids, not the Delhi Sultanate. These three, their ambitions were never to set up a permanent Muslim state in India. Their objective was never to set up Muslim governance. It was just raid and military, political and financial incentives, move back to our base, our capital outside. The Delhi Sultanate were the first Muslim dynasty, the first Muslim string of rulers to base themselves in India. They ruled from India. Their power base was in India, as the name suggests, from Delhi. So he captured in 1192. Now we have the next period of conquest. So Ghurids, again, they employed slave soldiers. So their army was made up of these slave soldiers called Mamluk. Mamluk just means somebody who's owned. And his main general was called Qutbuddin Aybak. Yep, and his name's there. Qutbuddin Aybak. He was, you could say, the first Delhi Sultan. Yeah, so Qutbuddin Aybak, and he gained power authority in 1206. Just to quickly look there now. The Delhi Sultanate, interestingly, isn't made up of one family, or two, or three, four, five. 5 different families together made up the Delhi Sultanate. First you had, just remember these names, you had the Mamluks first, meaning the slave soldiers of the Ghurids. Then you had the Khiljis. Then you had the Tughluqids, or you had the Tughlaqs, depending on if you're using the anglicized versions. Then you had the Sayyids, then you had the Lodis. After the Lodis you had the Mughals. So remember, Delhi Sultanate, 5 families, one after the other. They take over one after the other. And you've got the dates there, 1209 to 1290. I don't want to bore you with the dates, but everything's there. 1206, 1209, 1206, disputed figure, all the way up until 1526. Yeah? So now, just a bit of a spoiler. If the Delhi Sultanate ended in 1526, when do you think the Mughal Empire started?
The Mughal Empire started in 1524, actually started Emperor Bull control.
He's already doing his reading. Yeah, he's already given away some spoilers. MashaAllah, well done. 50, right, so again, you'd be forgiven for thinking that 1526 is the date when the Mughal Empire commenced. It's actually not. Even though, who was the first Mughal emperor? Babur. Babur was the first Mughal emperor. If we felt 1526. But that doesn't mark the start of the Mughal Empire. Neither from his son, it only started with his son, so the 3rd Mughal emperor. That's when the Mughal Empire really started. But we'll get to that later on. Anyway, so you've got all of these events that took place. I mean, we still haven't talked about the Mughals yet. But I think if we let's try and just go through this chart, and then hopefully next week what we can do is just quickly run through the Delhi Sultanate, because whenever I keep reading information, I keep thinking, right, let me try and condense it. And then something interesting pops up. No, hang on, right, we need to include that. And then something else, and something else. So there are always lots of interesting pieces of information. And some of them are important, are vital. If you gloss over them, then you've missed out a really important aspect that might help later on when we're talking about the Mughals. Especially when it comes to the middle one, the Tughlaqs. And again, you've got another figure from the Tughlaqs, Muhammad ibn al-Tughliq, who is similar to Mahmud of Ghazni and Aurangzeb. He's been made a target of Hindu nationalism. So, very quickly, we'll run through this chart, then I'm hoping next week, inshallah, what we can do is quickly run through Delhi Sultans, then go through the greater Mughals, then the next week, lesser Mughals, and I mean, I don't want to add a 5th session, because I don't want to long it out, but I mean, if we have to, then we might need to, but let's hope we can finish everything off. So you've got these 5 sultanates. The first one, Mamluks, because they were slave soldiers. And remember, in a slave dynasty, what's the succession policy like? Is it hereditary, where it goes to your son, then your son, then your son? How is it? The most competent. Survival of the fittest. If you're the most eligible to be the next leader, you'll be it, whether you were the predecessor's son or not. Most dynasties, Abbasids, Ottomans, and Umayyads, the main three juggernaut Muslim caliphates, have all been hereditary dynasties. Hereditary meaning father to son, then his son, then his son, then his son. Even though that's not ideal. It's not ideal, but it's not completely impermissible. Ideal is through mutual consultation, through an advisory board. Sultan dies, he'll either nominate somebody, and then the advisory board will pick the most suitable one. That's not always happened. Again, that's a story for another day. Muawiyah radiallahu anhu was the first one to introduce hereditary succession. He nominated his son Yazid, nearly 7-8 years before he even died. He said, my son Yazid is going to be the next caliph after me. So anyway, they were the elite guard of the Ghurids. Qutbuddin Aybak was their leader, and they lasted all the way up until 1290, and there were a few revolts in their dynasty, and they collapsed. Next one comes in now. These are the Khiljis. And the Khiljis were in charge for only 30 years, but what they achieved in 30 years can't go unnoticed. They repulsed the Mongols in 1299. 1258, the Mongols destroyed and ransacked and completely decimated, razed Baghdad to the ground. And they were on the hunt for blood. They were bloodthirsty, the Mongols. So they were expanding to the west, to the east, to the north, to the south. They set their eyes on India. So Muhammad ibn Tughlaq, sorry, not Muhammad ibn Tughlaq, the Khiljis were actually credited with pushing back the Mongols. Now, if they wouldn't have done that, we might not even have had the Mughals, because the Mongols destroyed everything in their path. If they got to Delhi, the Mongols, we might not have even had any of these three successive dynasties and even the Mughals. Who knows where we might have even been today. So that was a great service that they rendered. They then took control of Gujarat, Rajasthan and the Deccan. The Deccan is central India. And then the last leader was assassinated 1230. Move on to the next one, the Tughlaqs. The Tughlaqs, their founder was Ghiyath-ud-Din. He died after 5 years in an accident. His son, Muhammad ibn Tughlaq, now takes charge. Muhammad ibn Tughlaq, he had poor judgment, and there are some funny stories. He I don't know how you can botch up so badly. He made some really big blunders in his days in office, some really bad things. Just one of them, he changed the silver coinage, replaced it with brass and copper. Absolutely worthless. And that caused an entire economy crash. So, but he did manage to take lots of lands. 1398, he managed to repulse again the Timurid invasion. Who are the Timurids? We'll talk about them next week. I'll let you answer next week, mashallah. The Sayyids. Now, Timurids, they were a branch of the Mongols. Timurids came, they conquered, they put one of their own governors as now the leader of Delhi, called Khizr Khan. Why they call the Sayyids? Because they claim descent from the Prophet ﷺ. Is that descent true? Probably not. Again, just a legitimacy ploy. They were weak provincial rulers. They didn't actually do much. They owned a few provinces. After Timur came, India, which was one, it wasn't fully under Muslim control. You had these few regions and territories. Majority of it was under Muslim control, thanks to Muhammad ibn Tughlaq. When the Timurids came, shattered everything. When the Timurids came anywhere, they would completely destroy the political establishment. So there was no government. What we call an interregnum, where you've got a cessation, a stoppage in government now. So government isn't in power. There's nobody in charge. It's just a free for all. That's what happened. After Timur came, everybody was in it for themselves. I'm going to take this piece of land. I'm going to take this. I'm going to take that. So when Khizr Khan was appointed as the governor of Delhi, then he only had a small piece of land under his rule, even though the previous Tughlaqs had quite a vast amount. So they were just weak provincial rulers. Then the Lodis came. The Lodis were from Afghan, and they were the soldiers of the Sayyids, and they again revolted and they took charge. The Afghan Pashtun Lodis. They were 3 generations. You had Bahlul Lodi, who was a father, his son Sikandar, and his son Ibrahim. And Ibrahim actually faced, who did he face at the Battle of Panipat? Babur. He faced the first Mughal emperor, Sultan, if you want to call it that, at the Battle of Panipat, and surprise, surprise, spoiler alert, he lost. And that's when now the Mughal reign starts. So, we'll leave it there this week. Now, hopefully next week we can move into the Mughals, inshallah. So I hope the lessons be beneficial. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to inspire us with true knowledge and to study properly. Ameen wa akhiru da'wana alhamdulillahi rabbil alamin.